right, so welcome back to Cracks in Postmodernity. We have a very special guest, Tara Isabella Burton, who's the author of the book Strange Rites, as well as several other books, some new ones coming out soon, and has written many articles for different publications, including the New York Times, where I first discovered you. So, Tara, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. So, for people who haven't read Strange Rites, can you explain what is the gist of the book, and also what inspired you to write it? What experiences did you have that made you say you wanted to put out this book?
Uh, Hilariously, Strange Rites was almost written by accident, which is to say that I'd written a piece about cults for a British online magazine called Aeon, and someone had reached out to me about maybe doing a kind of guide to cults. And as the book proposal started for that, then suddenly another publisher was interested, and at that same time, I was working as the religion correspondent for Vox.com. That's with a V, not an F. And one of the sort of distinctive things about being the religion correspondent for Vox is that I was covering a lot of sort of traditional religion beats, especially this was 2017. So a lot of like Trump and evangelical story or Catholic church sex abuse scandal stories. But I was also sort of covering, by virtue of the readership and by virtue of the fact that I was in New York City and by virtue of the fact that I think they were very open to on the beat, I was covering a lot of like witches hexing Trump and yoga and self-care and other stories that perhaps at a larger outlet or an outlet with sort of more strict siloing might not have been religion stories, but were for a variety of reasons for me. And as this book project sort of started to take shape, I became less and less interested in cults as traditionally conceived and more interested in subcultures and ways in which spiritual practice and religious practice, particularly for millennials and younger, and in particular among the people who you might think of as progressive, though not exclusively, or simply, living in cities, living a little, who are not in traditionally culturally religious environments, what their religiosity looked like. And I think around the time that I was working, a lot of polls and studies came out kind of heralding the end of organized religion. About 25%, give or take, different polling systems have different numbers, but about a quarter of Americans identify as NONE, nuns. The rise of the nuns was a big trope, or spiritually unaffiliated. But if you actually started looking at those numbers and looking at other numbers, what I found is that the story of seeming secularization, the new secular age, in America at least, was really incomplete for two reasons. One was that an astounding number of people who put themselves as religiously unaffiliated, first of all, did not identify as an atheist or agnostic. And for what it's worth, atheism is often historically underreported on polls, so that could mean something else.
Yeah.
But about 72% of people who were unaffiliated said, I believe in something, there's something out there. And about 20% said, I actually believe in, I think the poll put it as the Judeo-Christian God. So there's this just dynamic going on where people who are not affiliated with a religious tradition, who do not like organized religion, nevertheless profess faith either in some kind of deity or even in a classical, the god of classical Abrahamic religion, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, something else that was sort of equally, if not more fascinating to me, is that people who did put Christian on the box or Jewish on the box or Muslim on the box, or form rather, their actual stated beliefs and practices were more diverse, more eclectic than you might think. My favorite statistic that I like to trot out, which I believe was from a Pew study, and I would like to say 2018, was that around 25 or so Christians, self-identified Christians, self-report believing in reincarnation. It was definitely, and with sort of similar numbers for the power of crystals and things like that. And I think when you look kind of more broadly at these numbers and weigh them all together, and also look on a sort of qualitative way at ways in which our culture is suffused with spiritual language to, I think, an even greater degree than I certainly remember in my own lifetime, we have this sense that our spiritual lives may be drawn now from the language of the sort of shared cultural language of wellness or the shared cultural language of energy, but there is a kind of non-dogmatic but still discernible religious ideology, something between an ideology and a sensibility that suffuses how more and more of us, both formally spiritual but not religious, as about 20% of the population identifies, and officially religious or not religious in a particular tradition, but still kind of mixing and matching and reimagining, and what I call in the book remixing religious traditions to kind of suit them. And the takeaway from this, the biggest change for me, which I argue is deeply rooted in a kind of wider way that the internet has transformed our sense of both self and faith, is the idea that we're kind of all developing our bespoke religions. We are all kind of the same way that our news feed curates exactly what we see based on our desires, that the objects we buy are presented to us according to whatever algorithms figure out what we like. So too are the ways in which we think about our relationships to one another, to a hypothetical creator, to the energy out there, whatever, however you want to describe it. All of this is kind of all of this revolves on this narrative that religion is something that I should make for myself to sort of serve my need of self-actualization. And I think that there's two distinct things that come from that. And one is that religion becomes deeply personal, deeply what I call intuitionalist, that every person kind of has, every person who exists in this culture, to a greater or lesser extent, I think has been encouraged to develop their own religion. The degree to, of course, which people sort of participate in that can be greater or lesser depending on other factors. But secondly, I think that this religious sentiment does have the character of a distinct ideology that you can sort of say it's not just that everyone has their own religion, but there are certain tenets to this, and this idea that I must look inward to find my truest self. That truest self is somehow linked to a nebulous energy out there in the universe that wants me to do well or wants me to flourish in a way that has to do with temporal happiness, and that other people, and particularly society as like broadly construed, are more likely than not to be a danger or a hindrance on that journey. That externalities, social, familial, cultural, are limitations on a self-expression of our truest self that allows us to kind of link up with what the divine wants for us. And I think you can see the roots of that particular, well, of course, there's always sort of broader Enlightenment roots to everything, but I particularly see the genesis of this in 19th century transcendentalism and the rise of new thought in the 19th century. And basically this distinctive American religious tradition, or like proto-religious tradition, combine it with the internet and you get the present moment.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about these kinds of spiritual positions in a way emulating certain fandoms of celebrities or certain pop culture phenomena. And I'm seeing this not only with religion and spirituality, but also with political positions, with moral positions that we take on. Oftentimes they don't actually reflect the way we live our everyday lives, or are not the product of some kind of coherent, rational thought process, but it's an attempt to project this, or to signal, as we say, virtue signal, our tribal belonging, that we're part of some entity that transcends ourselves. And this is why I think people are so adamant about posting it on the internet, making it known that these positions we claim to take on are signaling that we're part of something, that we're not alone in the cosmos, to quote Walter Percy. Yeah.
And I think that as we've become kind of more disembodied, not just in terms of internet use, but in terms of the ways in which our social relationships are less and less likely to be structured by where we live, our neighbors on our block, our larger extended families as families get smaller, suddenly we have the potential through the internet, a potential that like in many ways is great. I've made so many of my friends on Twitter, but that allows us to kind of create close, dense tribes that where we kind of all know each other or know of one another, in as if we were sort of living in a small town alongside wherever we actually live. And these communities are sort of, what I find fascinating, often founded on certain kinds of affinity. And I think that there's one way of looking at it, which is saying this is just, an example of affinity and desire taking over our culture, such that, even our tiny polities are affinity driven now. But I think that there's another way of looking at it, that the way in which one might discover a community of shared values that might indeed mimic sort of more traditional shared values communities is to find them online. And certainly anecdotally, the internet communities that I've been part of, some of which involve my religious life, some of which do not, have often successfully kind of functioned, maybe not as like an extended group of friends, I think slightly too big for that, but a kind of a community that does function as a community where it has the potential for offline friendship, it has the potential for real friendship, as well as being a kind of locus of discussion. So I don't want to say it's a uniformly bad thing.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think a lot of it, like you said, it's this product of this disembodiment from very concrete, tangible forms of shared life, of community. And I don't know, like I noticed this even in myself, like the positions, the beliefs we claim to espouse. Again, like they tend to be the fruit of, like you said, an affinity, a kind of taste that we have, the projection of some kind of internal predilection versus the fruit of some experience or something that's happened to us. And I see for myself a lot of the times, like I'll claim to believe something, but there's this huge cognitive dissonance between what I'm saying I believe and how I actually live. You know, you can see this in someone who's super critical of consumer capitalism and yet buys, you know, all these kinds of things that are advertised to them that have no real point. Like, whereas someone who claims to be a very devout Christian and you know, again, it's like we act in ways that often contradict what we say we believe. And I think, again, this is what tends to happen when our beliefs are not so much rooted in something that's happened to us or something that we experience every day versus this projection of something internal out into the world, you know. But I wanted to go back to what you were saying about and how this kind of uh, this explosion of different options that we have, like it makes me think of Charles Taylor, right? Now, you know, you've looked a lot into, who's a huge inspiration for me. Like he talks about this kind of nova effect that's happened where there's a plethora of options that we can choose from. And in a way, like it's a reaction to this experience of disenchantment, this kind of this modern moral order that he talks about, where things are kind of just purely rationalistic, kind of flat. So I don't know, what can you say about how a lot of the new kind of forms of spirituality we're seeing today are a reaction to this feeling that everyday life is disenchanted or kind of empty?
So my answer is twofold, and I'll sort of betray my hand here that Charles Taylor was a huge influence on me and has been since my grad school days. But I think that there is a kind of double reality, which is to say, I think that a lot of us will talk about, and a lot of people do talk about, a loss of enchantment as to talk about a certain kind of alienating or element of contemporary culture. That there is something missing, that there is something lost, that there is something that feels, as you say, empty. And yet I'm always wary of calling that a loss of enchantment, in part because I don't think we are as disenchanted as we either like to or worry about thinking, so much as we've relocated that enchantment. And I think we have, you know, if you want to pick a starting point, you could say the Renaissance onwards, but the modern condition, I think, is a relocating of the idea of enchantment from something that exists in the world that comes from God, but is very much a kind of something. It may suffuse everything, including us, but its source is outside us. To this idea that that enchantment is particularly internal or almost indistinguishable from certain distinctly human features. I believe, and this is the argument of my next book, that we have relocated enchantment in human desire. Obviously, there's narratives of this that will say it's human reason or it's the human will. But I think that we've come to a place where what we want, what we feel, and how that feeling transforms itself into like the way in which what we feel motivates us to act towards our goal of quote unquote self-actualization, is, I think, coded both implicitly and sometimes explicitly in our culture as magical or divine. I mean, there's a sort of fascinating tradition, both in European and American thought, and these parallel strains of talking about the sort of inner self as either divine or magical or possessed of magic powers. This is, of course, a huge part of like the New Thought tradition in 19th century America, where, you know, we can connect with I think the language of energy suffuses both narratives. Like we can connect with this energy in the universe by looking inward. And I think that if we do accept that we are seeing a relocation of enchantment rather than a disenchantment in contemporary culture, I think that opens up the question of what the feeling of the feeling commonly called disenchantment, or that like in a sort of more explicitly Taylorian model might be disenchantment, actually is. Is it just that certain elements of our lives are disenchanted because other elements wrongfully are? Is it another, an alienation that comes from a certain kind of loneliness because we're cutting ourselves off from other people? I'm not, I don't have a firm definition in my mind, but I do think that I think the thing that you're talking about, or that Taylor talks about as disenchantment, both is that and also perhaps warrants a more robust discussion if you hold, as I do, that enchantment is so completely wedded to the animating force of human desire.
Yeah.
I do think that, especially in the internet age, so much of our, like, not quite physical, but I would say our visual landscape, the world we inhabit, is the engine of it is desire. Eugene McCarher in his Enchantments of Mammon, of course, talks about capital and money as this like mysterious divine force. I take that, and I think this was hugely influential in kind of coming up with my own theory. But I think that it is, that you can look at the sort of, I'm always wary about saying the capitalist worldview, but the thing that would be described as the capitalist worldview as one iteration of desire having a kind of material manifestation, or the world running on desire in a certain way. And then the internet is that, but you can see it, and literally everything you look at on the internet runs on it, is like a desire powered engine. And so I think that we aren't just like in a world where desire is divinized. We are in a world where like desire is divinized, and then more and more of the world, it just like runs on desire fumes.
Yeah, and what you're saying, mentioning McCarr, as someone else who kind of builds on the Taylorian idea about disenchantment, is William Cavanaugh, who I think specifically in his book Migrations of the Holy, like his whole thesis is that it's not that we become totally disenchanted, it's that this enchantment has migrated other spaces, whether it's the free market, whether it's the realm of sexuality, consumption, like, because ultimately there's this, if you have the anthropological conviction that the human heart, human nature is fundamentally ordered towards some transcendent ideal, to this Augustinian restlessness, we could say, like, that spiritual dimension is never going to disappear. It's just going to have to be channeled elsewhere, So I mean, I agree with you to that extent. And I did want to bring up Camille Paglia, who I was telling you before, is a big inspiration for me. And I know you've read a lot of her work as well. I think what's interesting, especially in her commentary on religiosity in America, she talks a lot about how there's this, like, building on Nietzsche's polarity between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. There's this kind of Apollonian impulse in America, and especially in like Anglo WASP cultures, to create this sense of order, to create the sense of predictability, to clean up any sense of messiness, of chaos, unpredictability. And inevitably, this kind of impulse is only going to go so far, because then the force of nature, the Dionysian element, is going to, it's going to rear its head once again. And there's a lot of, when someone assumes that they can impose this kind of order, which again, Taylor talks about in the beginning of the secular age, like, if we naively think we can keep this up for very long, like, it's just not going to last. It is a naive position. And I think that what she sees in the 60s counterculture, but also what she kind of prophetically predicted today in this kind of turn towards sacramental religiosity, whether it's in high church Christianity or forms of, new age kind of witchcraft stuff that we see on TikTok, there's this need for the aesthetic dimension, the earthiness, the sacramentality that's missing from a lot of, at least we could say, mainline, especially Anglo, not Anglo in the Anglican church sense, but like the Anglo-Saxon sense. That's very rationalistic. That's very, much an experience of the mind and not one of the body. So no, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how, like, where do you see this attempt to grasp at the sacramental, the aesthetic, the bodily experience of spirituality and what's going on today?
I think we sort of seen different siloed versions of it. I think that where we have these, at least if you spend too much time on Twitter like I do, I think one of the most interesting kind of meme conglomerations of memes that you find are these kind of ways in which certain political identities and certain religious spiritual practices converge. I think like the proliferation of like witchcraft as a kind of feminist act. I think it's sort of post peak. Maybe I think its peak was sort of the post Trump era of the like resistance witch as the political figure. But I think that there's ways in which kind of not quite Wiccan, that's the wrong word, but like a general there's a sort of left neo-paganism that's a combination of coded as internal intuitional spirituality over and against the sort of imagined sort of Trump plus Catholic Church plus evangelical hierarchy all sort of conceived of together as like, this is the system and we are like we are countering in some way with this like particular image of resistance and bravery. But I think that the like more the weirder and perhaps for me analytically more interesting I don't want to make like moral claims, but the more interesting to me to write about is the kind of reactionary version of it, because it also and by which I mean this kind of like cultural miasma of people on the reactionary right who will often sort of conceive of like social justice warriors as being the same kind of like monolithic, culturally dominant force that the resistance, which is sort of used to say about Trump. Like I'm thinking of like the way that certain far right neo-reactionary figures will refer to it as the cathedral, but like there's this monoculture and we are resisting it. And suddenly everything from traditionalist Catholicism to sedevacantist Catholicism to Julius Evola tinged like formal occultist mysticism to like I'm thinking now like Nick Land living in Aleister Crowley's old house, like like very 19th century occultism all sort of converges on the reactionary side of things. And I'm interested in particular in the way that there's a kind of like robust tradition of like romantic reactionary Catholic occultism in the late 19th century as much as in our own era, where this sort of, I think that I won't say it's an intellectual move being made because it's not very coherent, but the sort of aesthetics move being made is something along the lines of we have lost the old gods. I mean, I think it's in some sense it is very like post Palia, although I don't think that maybe not so consciously so, but this idea that like we've lost the old primal forceful magic. There's a real like even I think often like traditionalist Catholics in this cultural world will focus more on like traditionalist versions of sex gender, that this is like the sexual binary and the idea that we know like men are men and women are women, and this is a kind of basis of like this sort of basis of the real is on the sort of the sexual binary and on ways in which the sexual binary can be understood as like oppositional in a way that seems to be very much about a fascination with restoring a kind of like primal magic that is I mean it is historical, but it's less historical in the eras that they're looking at and more like a distinctly 19th century like deeply like 19th century does the pre-modern world version of the pre-modern world. And I think it fascinates that fascinates me precisely because of its blend of aesthetics and hunger and the way in which very, very contemporary political concerns are being kind of reframed as this collective loss of the real, where what the real was reduced to or is signified by becomes like certain culture war points. And I'm interested in this particularly as someone who like does think we've lost the real, but is far more suspicious of the idea that the loss of the real depends on certain culture war points.
Yeah, no, and I think this whole conversation about like witchcraft, neo-paganism, it's overlooked too much because there's so much going on here. And I say this as someone like I grew up in a family that like practiced a syncretic version of like folk witchcraft and Greek Orthodox Christianity. Um, so like because take for example my grandmother, she would read people's coffee cups to predict their fortune, and it often came true. Like it wasn't just for fun. But then she would like go to the Greek Orthodox Divine Liturgy. She knew all the prayers. So it was this again this syncretic mix. And like when I was younger, I was interested both in the Christian liturgy, but also in like playing with tarot cards and Ouija. And eventually, like I hit a point where I realized like I don't know, I was toying with somewhat dangerous spiritual forces that I didn't want to involve myself in anymore. But the point is, like, I recognize there is something very real about those forces. They're very much like it for me, it wasn't just like a game or an aesthetic, but it was like, okay, there are these spiritual charges in the real world that do have an impact on me, for better or for worse. And I'm seeing now with like, I think at least on the left, you see the kind of woke witch phenomenon on TikTok, and like some of it I think is a genuine engagement with these spiritual forces. Some of it I think is just like, I don't know. I mean, not to knock people who are into manifestation techniques, but it is kind of just like a spiritualization of this neoliberal consumerist kind of ethic that like I want something and I project it into the universe and then I get it. Like, okay, I mean, if you have a credit card and a good inheritance, then you can basically do the same thing, and it's sprinkle your spiritual words on top. But on the right, as you were saying, like a lot of the reactionary positions from like the Trumpian type or the Peterson Daily Wire kind, like ultimately is a neo-pagan position, especially when we get into the white nationalism and whatever the ethno-nationalist kind of narratives. Like it's another brand of this kind of pagan worldview. Um, but ultimately, like I think going back to Taylor, going back to Palia, like there is this kind of demand for these more tangible engagements with spiritual forces, whether they're the monotheistic ones, whether they're pagan ones. And it makes me think of like I know you've written about this as well, like turn of the century decadence from France, from England, that a lot of them started out as like outright Satanists. Like if you take Huysmans or
Yeah.
to an extent Baudelaire, like we're engaging with straight up satanic, and then that took them the opposite direction to a very traditional form of Catholicism. But the point is that like their position was very much in contrast to this bourgeois kind of rationalistic one, this Apollonian one that's like, oh, we just have our reason, we try to create our predictable social order, and then everything's nice and clean cut, versus, okay, there are these spiritual forces outside of us that do have a real impact on daily life, whether it's Satan, whether it's God, the point is there's something more. And I don't know, personally, like I'm happy to see that people are interested once again in these positions that take up a real engagement with whichever spiritual forces are out there. I think there's a need to really recognize that, though, because again, it's like what I don't like is seeing how like take someone like Peterson, who has this kind of reactionary right-wing position, and then you have Christians saying like, oh, he's standing up for truth, and it's like, okay, but that's as much as he may engage with certain Christian pundits, like that's not an actual Christian position. Like sure, ideologically there may be some overlap, but like this is fundamentally a kind of neo-pagan one.
Absolutely. And I was sort of, this leads me to a point that I'm still wrestling with, but I think that I'm coming towards affirming more robustly rather than cautiously. And again, I know that at various times recently, Jordan Peterson has called himself a Christian. I don't want to risk maligning anyone's personal faith, but in terms of how sure. There seems to be among the traditionalist right more broadly this sort of conception of Christianity that's like a combination of like, these are our allies because they share our traditionalist goals, and like Christianity is good because it like, whether or not it's true in this kind of like vague Jungian like primal sense where it gets you to the like right basic positions. And there's a kind of real like make your own religion instrumentality to this that reflects like the wellness culture on the left, which is the more obvious target of this. But secondly, I think another weird pagany place that left and right converge here is this idea that like there is something that is magic and is spiritual, and it has to do with ways in which human beings can manipulate reality, which in turn has to do with our ability to manipulate like language, object, and symbol. the kind of root of certain kinds of ceremonial occult magic. Again, going back to the Crowleys and sort of the Theosophists of the world, this idea that like what magic is, maybe we're a little too modern to say like we can shoot fireballs from our hands, although I do love that story about like Crowley and Yates getting into like a magic fight and yelling spells at each other until I think Yates just kicked Crowley and then he lost the fight, which is anyway. But this idea that like magic is actually the manipulation of reality, and you can manipulate reality by like either manipulating people or by kind of manipulating yourself such that your outlook changes, but that there is something called magic that is worth practicing ritualistically, that has a tangible real world manifestation, but that it does not necessarily involve like breaking the laws of physics so much as operating on this cultural linguistic plane, so that like human interaction is the realm of magic. Now, as a novelist, like I think that there is a like good version of this that's something to do with like something about human communication and art that is sort of powerful and can potentially point to the good. Like I don't want to be like all language is bad and we should just, I don't know, only communicate in mime, but that wouldn't work either. But I think that there's this obsession with like on the right and the left, and I think this is where like manifestation comes into it, but also the kind of right-wing neo-pagan obsession with like ceremonial magic, as well as Christianity as being like affirmation of Christian truth being useful, is this like very, very contemporary human beings are magic, or again, our desire is magic, and how we manipulate reality. I'm thinking too of like meme magic as this thing that for those of the unfamiliar listeners became this like what was then I guess the alt-right obsession with getting Trump elected through like Pepe memes, where it was this idea that like we can just, especially in this era of the internet where physical embodiment is even less of a hindrance than in the quote unquote real world, suddenly magic and reality converge, and this is fascinating. And like I think they're onto something as a descriptor of a phenomenon that is true of the internet age, while being like, maybe don't fuck with demons, even if you think your demons are you, and especially not if you think your demons are you. But I do think that they're, without maybe to be charitable or add a charitable note in this conversation, I can see how there is a real hunger for the real, or something that is true, even as all of us are stuck in this like soup of self-deification. And of course, going back to Huysmans, who you mentioned earlier, I feel like he's the pioneer of this trope, because Là-bas, his 1891 novel about Satanism, what's fascinating is it's a novel about how boring Satanists are in 1891. Like he's writing this biography of Gilles de Rais, this medieval Satanist, rapist, murderer, and it's really graphic and really awful. But Durtal, like basically Huysmans' stand-in, is sort of constantly meditating like in the old days the Satanists would like murder children and there would be blood everywhere, and like obviously it was awful, but like at least they were doing something. And today I go to these like Satanist parties, and he goes to the Black Mass with his lover, and he kind of goes like, wow, this is really lame and cringe. And you know, he has this weird division where he says there's this great line where he basically says like, where are you, like we're like Jesus Christ, like please come down and like strike us down, or like, you know, we won't say that, like we want something real here. And the fact that these like bougie idiots are having this awkward Black Mass, like I feel like the book is often like misremembered now as this like very spooky book about like creepy Satanists, and it's actually like a book about how bourgeois 19th century bored people are hoping that Satan or God or someone will come into the room to lift them out of their stupor. And even if it does turn in, and then I think this sort of interesting parallel that we do have is that Huysmans' like weird, or Durtal, his character's weird obsession with Gilles de Rais and with like the good old days of murder and transgression, I think sets the stage for something we do see in particularly like the transgressive, offensive, or offensive to me at least, language of the far right, which is like, let's be as awful as possible. And there's a way in which transgression and provocation, of course you could say this, like Sade perhaps was the originator of this, although I think Sade in my mind does not have any like spiritual hungers, like Sade's just dick. But let's start with Huysmans onwards. Transgression and perversion almost as like an attempt to like shock God into existing, or like shock something, shock oneself into reality. Like, if we are bad enough, if we say the bad enough thing, um, can we like lure God out of heaven again? And
Yeah, and I don't think it was Wiesmann. I think it was Baudelaire who said that like Satanism was his way into Christianity through the back door. And
I'm not sure. It might be. I feel like it was
yeah,
true of all of them. So
yeah, of course, especially for Durkheim. But I don't know. I mean, I'm a proponent of everybody reading Wiesmann. I think things will make a lot more sense if people read him because he was onto something. He knew it was coming. But anyway, so speaking of Wiesmann, it brings me to your article. I think it was 2020 in New York Times
mhm.
about Weird Christianity, the traditionalists, distributists, and all that. Um, I don't know. I'm curious to hear. There's just so much to say about this kind of trad phenomenon, especially as it's making its way more and more into mainstream public's attention. But I don't know. What are some things that you see there? What are some things you think people should take note of in this phenomenon?
So even more than when I wrote the piece in 2020, which was itself a kind of shorter version of the piece that was supposed to exist because post-pandemic everything got a little chaotic. But I think I was interested in this idea that quote unquote traditionalist Christianity, which didn't just mean right-wing reactionary Catholicism, but meant a kind of sacramentally loaded, let's say resurrection affirming, like sacramentally and supernaturally truth claiming making Christianity, had on both aesthetic and kind of narrative grounds appeal for the very young and online in a way that combine, let's say, a spiritual impulse, aesthetic impulse, and a kind of like subcultural impulse to like form an identity. I think the headline that the New York Times came up with was "The future of Christianity is punk,"
Yep.
where I both was like, oh God, like this is gonna make Twitter so mad, but like not entirely wrong. Not because Christianity is punk so much as like so much of what it means to figure out one's identity online with reference to traditionalist Christianity is itself a kind of, it's a very subcultural, like let's piss off the normies or define ourselves against the normies way of looking at it. And I think that certainly since that article came out, we've seen, I don't want to talk about Dime Square, but I'll talk about Dime
I
Square.
was waiting for it.
The thing, the unnamed triangle in Lower Manhattan, that this idea of like being a kind of particularly a right-wing Catholic or even like sedevacantist Catholic has now become a kind of a pose that in a certain kind of cultural discourse that also includes like the Curtis Yarvins of the world, that also includes like certain post-rationalists, that also includes like a number of different subcultural tribes, basically what seems to me united against the common enemy or specter of the quote unquote social justice warrior, quote unquote woke, like Brooklyn literary person who, like, to be fair, I don't think I've ever met who don't, I think, exist as the monolith that they're presented as. Like, I think they're as much a like monster under the bed as anything else, but that this sort of group came together, perhaps one might say around a common enemy, but with a very like similar to the decadence of the 19th century, a self-understanding that transgression, and particularly a kind of reactionary transgression, was the best way as a kind of aesthetic mode and pose to combat a certain kind of bourgeois moralistic seriousness that in their minds both removed style from the world and also didn't actually, like, wasn't actually based on any kind of real moral principles either. And I think that sort of double fascination, which with like the modern world is boring and like the wokes are so cringe, but also, hey, there is something that we're missing and like not getting from the dominant, the dominant or seemingly dominant in like media circles culture. Those things are both true and then sort of combine in a way that I certainly associate with like the fin de siècle of like right-wing, transgressive, reactionary, highly aesthetic. And I think that it's very difficult to disentangle. And here, this is why I'm deeply wary. Like, I'm as wary as anyone who is also a Christian who made a lot of Christian friends on Twitter can be of faith becoming part of one's brand soup,
Mhm.
or like subcultural brand identity, which is to say, I don't think we can get out of it. I certainly haven't got out of it. But I do think that you do get some very strange bedfellows when your traditionalist Christianity means that you're willing to kind of like make alliances with neo-pagan powers.
Yeah.
That's just like, I feel like if you're going to be a traditionalist Christian, just like never a good idea, or something to be extremely wary of in general.
Yeah.
Which is not to say this is the part of the podcast where I actually say that Times Square is full of demons. I'm not actually literally saying that, really.
There. I'm sure there are demons there.
But I
But
do
it's
think it's
but it could be the
interesting.
back door to something better, as Baudelaire said. I don't know. I mean,
I think that spiritual hunger is generally good, and
yeah,
conversations about spiritual hunger are very good, and a search for moral realism is a very good thing, and that all of these things are goods that we should uphold. Um, at the same time, I do worry that the like right neo-pagan and sacramental Christian alliance, which you see both on this like sceney hipster soup level of like the Red Skirt Girls are Catholic, but you also see in, for example, I do like and respect Bishop Barron as an interviewer very much, but like Bishop Barron's sort of alliance with Jordan Peterson at one time,
yeah,
this idea that like the right neo-pagans, broadly construed, and the like Orthodox Christians, lowercase o, can work together to defeat the common enemy. Um,
yeah, no.
that's the point where I think like one can critique the dominant culture, one can critique excuse me, all contemporary ideologies,
Mhm.
but like as soon as the focus turns obsessively on the quote unquote social justice warriors as the enemy or the number one enemy, I think it makes us blind to more interesting questions of what one might be fighting against or for. And I think it also elides the difference between like, are you like, what are your actual issues with this particular cultural ideology that seems more dominant in media circles versus like what is your general approbation for like the normies, whatever they might be.
Yeah,
And if the normies were all Catholic, like would your punk subculture just go back to pure Satanism?
yeah, no, no, and
And I think
yeah, I agree with you that like it's not a substantial position in itself. Like it doesn't propose any real answers or solutions. I'm super weary of usually older people, normie boomers, whatever you want to call them, who are very quick to dismiss the phenomenon because I think like, and as much as it's not a solution in itself or a real coherent position, like it's a cultural specimen that needs to be looked at seriously, especially by the people to whom it's a reaction. Because, for example, like when you put that article out in the Times, like there were like two articles that I wrote kind of inspired by what you were kind of highlighting. And the pushback, it's like, I'm going to be specific. And if it pisses people off, then what am I going to do? There is a response in National Catholic Reporter written by someone who is significantly older who was saying, like, okay, these kids think they're punk, but like, they're basically dumb kids. They don't know what they're talking about. And I got really pissed off. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to respond to this saying, like, okay, you're old and people are tired of this worldview that you're espousing. So, like, rather than like telling the kids to simmer down, like, why don't you look at the fact that, okay, yeah, no, this isn't a coherent position, but within it, there's this intuition, there's this cry for something that we've been deprived of. And then the other thing that, like, especially after the Pope did the motus proprio about the Latin Mass, I think it's super reductive to pit like the trads and the Novus Ordo, the whatever, against each other because it's like within that group, there's a whole variety of people who are drawn to whether it's the more dogmatic form of morality and doctrine or the sacramentality, the aesthetic vibe of it all. Like there are people who really feel alienated from the kind of dominant Christian kind of ethos or narrative. And that's why, like I was telling you before, I was trying to highlight that the fact that when you go to a Latin mass, whether it's High Church Anglican, whether it's Catholic, also, in a lot of Eastern Orthodox churches, you see a lot of people who are on the spectrum, who are neurodivergent. You see a lot of queer identifying people. Also, people who just like don't identify with Anglo-Saxon culture in general. It's become a haven for a lot of people who feel very alienated, and that's why I feel like if to just write people off as like reactionaries or ideologues, it's like, okay, but why are people drawn to it? It's not purely some kind of it's not purely ideology. Like there's a need there that has to be taken seriously.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I remember back when one of the sort of most prominent backlash points to my article was like, this must be this very like white, straight, conservative phenomenon. So again, purely anecdotally, so my version of this is actually, I'm Episcopalian, sort of High Church Anglican, or High Church Episcopalian, Anglo-Catholic should say. My parish is I'd say the most, definitely the gayest and the most ethnically diverse church I've ever been in. It's in terms of like, it is compared to both the sort of stereotype of like churches, particularly Episcopalian churches, as being quite monocultural. That is absolutely not the case. And I think like this is something that I don't want to extrapolate like from my one small church that this is true of all churches, but I think it's certainly this narrative that like high church, liturgically rich, supernaturally affirming Christianity is something that is like, to say that it is just a like straight white phenomenon seems to be like the opposite of my anecdotal truth. My anecdotal experience.
I think we have to acknowledge like geography makes a difference, because like, for example, if I go to Holy Innocents in Midtown Manhattan, like super ethnically diverse, gender queer diversity, clearly a lot of people on the spectrum. You got all kinds of people. When I go in New Jersey in the suburbs, it's not the same story. But again, it's like, I think this kind of horseshoe phenomenon of quote unquote countercultural, super postmodern types being drawn to this other opposite extreme of religious traditionalism, like, again, it's not a phenomenon that we can afford to just dismiss or ignore. But on the other hand, like, especially the more like dogmatic Shia LaBeouf type of trads, like what I think like is most concerning is that a lot of these people really think like, no, this is the correct position, like this is a righteous position, as opposed to Red Scare types who are like, this is a vibe, we're LARPing. Like ultimately being a trad is a LARP. Like you're reacting to other forms of performance art or other constructions of identity that you deem to be like, oh, this is super worldly, this is super, we're not like that. But it's like, okay, but any form of performance art ultimately is very postmodern. It's very, secular, whatever you want, however you want to use that term. So like when you did it in an ironic, self-conscious way, sure, but like the ones who are like, no, we are the defenders of the true faith, it's like, no, you're not. You're not. Like it's you're playing a game. You're playing the game.
And I mean, I think that I do. There is time, and maybe this is my aesthetic rather than like considered intellectual view, but like there is a place for play and joyful play and self-presentation that can lead us to a greater truth. I don't think we must all be like painfully earnest all of the time. Although I think that I have become, at the same time, I think I've come much more to the like painfully earnest end of the spectrum, where like I think earnestness is a great place to start. And I think that like at its best, what play can do is like allow us to form relationships with one another, to like acknowledge how many unknown unknowns, what have you, there are, and that play could be a kind of vehicle for exploring ideas and community. But I think the point at which play goes from a kind of like joyful, even childlike, like okay, like we're a little bit in the sandbox here, we're all figuring this out. We believe the things we believe, and yet how do we sort of work this into our full cultural lives is one thing. The point at which I think certain kinds of LARPing become worrying to me is that there's a certain nihilism that I think is at the core of like, well, none of this really matters anyway, so let's just like fuck around and say something crazy. And as I said, maybe my like Heismanian version of like, maybe troll it, like if you troll hard enough, like God will come down. I don't want to discount that there's a hunger there, even though I don't want to like stake the claim that like this is what's happening. But I do think that there is
Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, I mean,
on his deathbed, but
yeah, it's like could just do it sooner. I do think that there is something sort of deeply nihilistic in the point where like play as a kind of youthful way of exploring ideas and exploring the ways that ideas might be lived out, which are not always fixed or obvious, turns into a kind of, well, it doesn't really matter what we say. And I think once you reach that level of it doesn't really matter, it's all kind of fake, who cares, is the point at which you've like lost the very thing you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I think there comes a point of maturity where like you find a happy medium between the totally nihilistic sense of playfulness that doesn't recognize like, yeah, that's assumes that nothing matters, versus the extreme earnestness, like we are the defenders of the truth. And
Yeah.
like there needs to be some sense of like ironic self-deprecatory detachment while still seeking something that's genuinely true.
Yeah, I mean, I think ironic detachment is best when it's a form of humility. Like,
It
look,
is,
I'm just a person trying to figure out this really complicated thing out, and like here's the best I have. And I think that detachment where like we all really like should just like touch some grass, and
yeah.
that knowledge I think keeps us honest.
No, I think that's fair. But I did want to ask more just about your experience within Episcopalianism, because so you were raised in the Episcopal
Yeah.
Church, right?
I mean, I'm born and raised in New York as well. So I was raised, let's just say I was raised going to like a very Christmas and Eastery
Mm-hmm.
Episcopal church. My family's sort of like Jewish-ish, like
Jewish, yeah,
yeah, like Jewish-ish, but Christmas and Easter in a kind
yeah,
of like, we're not really observant, but like we have a kid, like Christmas, like
sure,
Santa. And I was like a weird kid. So I was like, Mommy, can I get baptized? Can I be Catholic? And there was like, okay, fine, can I be Episcopalian? Because like that's the church nearest us. So there really was a, other than like weird childhood vibes. I think I've said this on other podcasts, but like some kids just got into horses, and I just got like really into like God stuff, saints. I saw a movie about Joan of Arc. I think that was it. But then somehow became a academic theologian. Would have called myself Christian. Didn't think too much about it. Still like went to church on Christmas and Easter. And then somehow when I came back to New York, after my time working at or during the time that I spent, I was in England until 2017. Off and on for a later period of that, working my doctorate. Got this job at Vox. Was suddenly full time in New York. Like fully almost everything that I've written about in Strange Rites is something that I've probably like been involved with at some point. I did my soul cycle,
mm-hmm.
did my witch rituals, and I think that at the end of that process, I ended up going back to church, brought by someone I met on Twitter, and realized, oh yeah, maybe this thing that seems that like has actually dominated my entire life so far is a thing I should be paying attention to. This seems very obvious in retrospect, and became a every week church person, and would call myself a Christian and like robustly like make that a part, like that is now the sort of grounding philosophical principle of my life, rather than simply something that is like part of this motorsport of what I do. And within that, I'm like deeply, I love the Anglo-Catholic tradition. I do find it to be spiritually that which helps me connect with God in the most great way, but I'm very wary of like drawing a line in the sand and saying like this is the way to do it. I think you know what, I'm gonna be, if I'm in a town and there's a church and it's a right to church with like guitar music, that's fine too. That's still church, and I'm very wary of kind of conflating like something that for me is a personal help in my faith with the faith that I think is true and right, that like I would defend on non-personal aesthetic grounds. So insofar as I have been affected by the modern world, that I want religion to work for me, as and perhaps we all are. Maybe that is why I'm an Anglo-Catholic and not, my church does not have like contemporary electric guitar. But I do want to make that distinction between, I don't know, what we can, where church shopping or personal preference makes sense and where it perhaps should be avoided.
Yeah. And what I was gonna ask though, like, because in New York, especially in Manhattan, like most of the Episcopal churches tend to be more high church, right?
Mm-hmm. I can speak to all of them, but I'd say that
Okay.
there are quite a lot of like, there's not just one Anglo-Catholic parish in New York, of the ones that are there's certainly some diversity in like political leaning
Mhm.
or age or what have you. So I think it might just be a function of size of the city.
Because I mean, at least the church buildings themselves, like they're amongst the oldest church
Oh,
buildings in
yes,
New York.
absolutely.
So like aesthetically speaking, the architecture really is, more traditional. But the main Anglo-Catholic church is St. Thomas on Fifth Avenue.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
I
Yeah,
was.
I've been
I'm no
there.
longer a parishioner there, but I was. I mean, not. I was at one time, and it was a really. I was confirmed there. It's a
Yeah,
really lovely church.
yeah. My favorite one is Church of the Intercession in Washington Heights.
Oh,
That's one of the most beautiful ones that I've seen. But there are so many beautiful Episcopal churches in New York. I do have one last question, somewhat
ooh.
unrelated. Um, Current state of Islam, different strains within Islam today. What do you see? Yeah, what do you see going on in that realm?
Oh,
It's a broad question.
I am not enough of a specialist to give an intelligent answer.
Okay,
I'm afraid. So I'm gonna decline.
okay. Now, because I'll just say this, that like I'm seeing similar within Christianity, like the more dogmatic kind of appeal of a more fundamentalist position within Islam. Um, but also, I think they're starting to emerge the more kind of aesthetic draw, the mystical draw, at least within the Sufi tradition.
Mm,
Also within the very robust philosophical tradition of Islam, that very quickly gets overlooked because of the polemics of ISIS and different terrorist organizations. But
mm,
again, I think what's going on there, especially and also like you see this in Wellbeck in submission, like there's
mm,
a lot of these kinds of conflicting tensions within secular world and different forms of religion, like you see reflected in Islam, and in a way that's there are similarities, but also things that are very unique, very particular to that tradition. Um, but anyway, what I want to ask before we close, you have two books coming out this year.
I do. So the one that I'm allowed to talk about
Okay.
is called "Self-Made: Creating Our Identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians." It's a cultural history of self-creation of both dandies and entrepreneurs, arguing why they're two sides of the same coin. With the little we got Beau Brummel, we've got Oscar Wilde, we've got Nietzsche. Anyway, that comes out in late June from Public Affairs. It's available for pre-order now. And then there is a novel I'm not allowed to talk about that will either come out at the end of the year or early next year. But
Awesome.
if you follow me on Twitter at NotoriousTIB, you'll probably hear about it when I can tell you.
Great. And anything else you want to plug, Tara?
No, no.
That's it.
Thank you.
Well, in that case, thank you so much for coming on. This was fun.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Right.